Hello, everybody. Welcome. Just gonna take a few moments to let folks join in. Everyone's just trickling in as we speak. Hopefully you can hear my sound. If you could just give me a thumbs up, that would be great. Oh, nice. Perfect. Okay, well, I think we can get started. And for those of you who are wondering, we are currently recording the session and we will be recording any future sessions as well. But on that note, please feel free to share your name, your role, and where you're joining us from in the chat. Hopefully, some of you are joining us from a sunny location. I am in Toronto at the moment, but yeah, just let us know where you're tuning in from. All right, well, welcome everyone to the Back to School Summit hosted by Spaces EDU. We're really excited to have you here today, joined by our lovely keynote, Natalie, and we are very thrilled to have her here to join us and start us off with the keynote. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules here. To ask any questions, feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll be using the chat feature for discussion questions. And if you are interested in signing up for future Back to School Summit sessions, the rest of the sessions for today, it is still possible to do so. I'm just going to give you the link in the chat, but you feel free to also scan the QR code on your screen to register. And here's just a schedule at a glance. We have a jam-packed day today with 6 sessions offering you a glimpse into updates that are happening at Spaces EDU, how you can implement it in your classrooms. There's focus on how to get started, how to implement best practices for specific grade levels, whether that's primary classrooms or even students at a more intermediate level. Lots of talk around competency-based assessment and also student-centered portfolios. And the last session we're offering is an overview of our Spaces EDU journey, where we started and where we're at currently. So definitely a session I would recommend joining, so you could also contribute your own feedback and your wish list as educators who are using Spaces EDU today. On that note, I'm thrilled to be introducing our keynote speaker, Natalie Vardabasso. She is a seasoned educator. I'm sure you've heard of Natalie before. She has a wealth of experience in equitable assessment and grading practices. Throughout her career, Natalie has served as a teacher, instructional coach, and assessment lead, where she played a pivotal role in transitioning her community to outcomes-based grading. She continues to empower teachers to use assessment as a powerful tool for learning. And currently, Natalie is an associate with the Solution Tree Assessment Center. She's the founder of the Empowerment Ecosystem and the host of the EduCrush podcast. We're incredibly fortunate to have her with us today to share her insights. So please join me in welcoming Natalie.
Awesome. Thanks, Tatiana.
Yeah, of course.
Perfect. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. And then we'll get started. So I was seeing in the chat there that I have a lot of fellow BC folk joining. So hello, I'm joining from Vancouver, BC. I previously was in Calgary, Alberta. So shout out to the one other Albertan that I saw jumping in. It's a bit of a cold, rainy day here in Vancouver, and I live right by the SkyTrain. So heads up in advance if you hear that in the background. But I'm super excited to be chatting with you all today about reimagining assessment to tell the story of learning. It's a big, bold title. We're going to go there because for too long, we have had such a narrow story of learning that assessment has told. It typically is gathered in test or quiz scores and then communicated as a letter grade. And of course, if you're here, you probably recognize that there is so much more to that story. So we're going to tap into that and talk about that today. I should first say before we go any further, because it never fails. If you're here and you're watching and you're reading my name on the screen right now, you're like, okay, that seems phonetically correct, pretty easy last name. And then you're going to go and tell someone about the session and say, yeah, I went to this great assessment session with Natalie Vartabasco. Yeah, I think that's it. It happens every time. It's phonetically correct, but there's too many syllables. So I'm going to teach you how to say my last name proper right now. And to do that, you have to do one simple thing. You just have to turn on your Italian speaking mode that looks like this and say Vardabasso, and then you'll never forget about it. If that doesn't work, the other way that people often remember it, my students definitely did, is that if you take the B and the D in my last name and you switch them around, a fun little swear word emerges. I'm not going to say it aloud because we're in polite company, but if you figure that out yourself, kudos to you. It's not the worst swear word to have in your last name. But alas, I'm Natalie Vardabasso. Feel free to just call me Nat. That also works. And like Tatiana introduced, I have been in education for quite a while in many different roles. I started out in Calgary, Alberta, because I left my hometown in BC to pay off student debt, as you do, as a high school teacher, eventually became a middle school teacher, and then moved into instructional coaching for a number of years before niching down, so to speak, into this assessment leadership space. And as of May 2022, so just over 2 years now, I've been working full time as an international speaker, consultant, coach with schools and districts across North America to take up this work. And then the last thing I wanted to let you know about, which is exciting and is really going to form the foundation of a lot of what we talk about today, is my first book is coming out hopefully late 2024, if not early 2025, depending on how fast I can get through editing. It's called Rehumanizing Assessment Through Story. It is written with co-author Tom Schimmer. Thank you so much for the little hands up and the love. I appreciate it. So a lot of what we talk about today is going to be coming from that book. But without any further ado, I feel it's important we first double tap on the big concept that this entire time together is going to be inquiring into, which is assessment. So I want to ask you, as we get started, to think to yourself, to activate your own background knowledge. What comes to mind for you when you hear the word assessment? How would you define it? Go ahead, you can write it down if you just want to do this on your own, if you're taking notes, or if you're feeling so bold, feel free to put it in the chat. But what comes to mind for you when you hear the word assessment? I know along my journey, I often thought back to my very, very brief time in university where we talked about assessment. I don't know if anyone else can relate, but we were learning about like Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and constructivism and all these big theories. And then they're like, oh yeah, and then there's this thing, assessment. There's formative, which is for learning, and there's summative, which is of learning. And it's really important you know those two. Moving on, and then you're just left to figure it out completely on your own in your first couple of years in the classroom. So that's where my understanding of it started. And then when I tried to piece it together, I often thought back to my time in school. And when I hear the word assessment, I thought, oh yeah, a test a teacher gives their students to figure out if they've learned something. That's assessment. And so we've also learned now that there's so much more to that story. And my first clue to this was when I became the assessment lead in my district. And I decided I wanted to sit with all my senior grade 12 students and say, okay, you've been in this system for a while now. What does assessment mean to you? And I'll never forget, I asked the question and the whole group got really quiet and really awkward. And I'm like, is that too hard a question? Do you know what I'm talking about? And finally, one bold student, we'll call him Chris, he leaned to me and he was like, Ms. Vardabasso, the problem is we don't want to answer because we don't want to hurt your feelings. I was like, say more about that, Chris. And he's like, well, when you say the word assessment, nothing good comes to mind. And I was like, that's fair. And you're not hurting my feelings. I totally understand. Because the truth is, a lot of the definition around assessment has a lot to do with an emotional experience. It feels like judgment. It can feel scary. And it doesn't have to be this way. But yet it is. And of course, that's easy for me to say sitting here in my office in Vancouver, but it's better if I show you an example of that because I was an English teacher, so I firmly believe in show, don't tell. And so I want to start today with a story of an assessment that still sticks with me from my time in school because it was such an emotional experience for me. And as I share this story with you, I want you to think of an assessment that also sticks with you. And it could be for positive reasons. Maybe it really instilled hope and confidence and changed your trajectory in a positive direction, or it could be something that sticks with you because it triggered fear and shame and judgment. So I'm going to start with my story, and then I'm going to ask for you to think about your story. You can put it in the chat if you want to, or you can just note it down, either way. But an assessment that still sticks with me from my time in school is a little something called the Mad Minute. I can't see you right now, but I guarantee that if I could, there was like a 50-50 split in the group. Half of you, your eyes just lit up and you're like, oh, are we doing one? Is there a competition? Will there be a gold star? The other half of you were likely like trauma response, deep breathing, and having to work through all of that. So wherever you stand on the Mad Minute, if you don't know what it is, it looks like this. It's a simple page of algorithms. And the idea is you have to do as many as you can using only mental math in 1 minute. So my story is in grade 4. I was a kid who loved math, mostly because my dad was a high school physics teacher. So we would spend the evenings talking about math. I think he took a lot of pride in the fact that despite I didn't know the basic concepts, I would use my problem solving skills to figure out high school level questions. And I'm sure he bragged to all his friends about it and was like, oh, yeah, she's going to Harvard for sure. So when the Mad Minute came along in grade 4, I thought, cool, awesome. This is going to be great. I love math. But there's another thing that's true about me you have to understand. I spend a lot of time lost in my own trains of thought. It could be something that is undiagnosed to this day, but I get really distracted and I get in my head about things and I lose track of time quickly. So the Mad Minute started. I did the first question, no problem. Got to the second question. I was like, 4. What's the nature of 4? Ooh, it'd be really nice to have 4 cats. I wonder what my cat's doing right now. Timer goes off. I didn't even make it through the first row. I was like, that's fine. It's math. We're learning. But then the teacher made a decision. She said, I want you to take your scores and let's put them up on a wall and we're going to rank them in order to have a little bit of a friendly competition. I bet you can guess where my score fell on that list. It was directly at the bottom. And I felt this first pang of emotional hit in my stomach. And it wasn't even that I was upset I was losing or upset I was bad at math. What I thought immediately was, I hope my dad doesn't find out, because if he does, he's not going to love me anymore because math is our thing. And then he's going to know the truth. So as you can imagine, anxiety abounded. So the next time the Mad Minute came around, I did exactly what you're not supposed to do to think faster and harder, yell at yourself in your head, go faster, go faster, go faster, go fast. So of course I can't think of anything. I panic. I'm like, I don't even know how to do this anymore. Got no answers, bottom of the list. So this went on week after week after week until it basically became Pavlovian. Like the teacher would say Mad Minute, Natalie would start crying. And then my worst fear was realized because the phone call went home. And yes, phone call, like pick up because age. Hello, Mr. Bartabasso. We're concerned that Natalie might have a math disability, perhaps some emotional regulation issues. Can you please come in for a meeting? And so I'm sitting here and it's me, my dad, and the teacher. And the teacher asked the $1,000,000 question that changed the trajectory of my life. She said, Natalie, help us understand what's going on here for you. Now, my friends, there are 2 pathways that I could have taken in that moment. There was the growth pathway and the self-preservation pathway. The teacher was really hoping I would choose the growth pathway, the one that sounds like, oh, you know what? Gee, Mrs. Barling, I've really been struggling with this, but I'm going to pull up my socks and practice more and train, and I'm going to master that Mad Minute. I did not choose that pathway. I chose the self-preservation pathway, which sounds like this. Well, you see, the problem is I just hate math. It's so boring. And from that point forward, I became the theater kid, broke my dad's heart, decided I want nothing to do with math. And to this day, I still have to catch myself because if someone brings up math or talks about math, I have this involuntary reaction on my face. I scoff or I roll my eyes, even though at a much more mature age, I now know myself to be a very logical thinker, a very linear thinker, someone who is exceptional at problem solving, a lot of things that make someone a great mathematician. But because of that one experience, I, to this day, struggle to see myself as a math person. And now I want to ask you, just before we go any further, I warned you at the beginning that I was going to ask you to think about an assessment that still sticks with you from your time in school. Something that sticks with you either for positive reasons or for negative reasons, but you remember it vividly. You don't have to share the full assessment story in the chat. Obviously, that would take you a bit of time. Feel free if you want to, just as your own act of reflection. You could even just write Mad Minute in the chat. just to say, yep, I've got a mad minute. I have exactly what you have. I totally remember that experience for me. I still remember where I was. I remember who was involved. I remember all of it. It totally sticks with me. Okay. I'm sure there is something coming up for each of you because whether positive or negative, the truth here is that we all have an emotional reaction to the prospect of being assessed, every single one of us. And sometimes the further we get away from being a student in the classroom, the more that we forget how vulnerable and how powerful that emotional reaction is. But the good news is people who are designers of the assessment and grading systems our students exist in, we can design opportunities that lead to a productive emotional experience, one that promotes hope and self-efficacy and inspires further learning. Or we can create experiences that have an unproductive emotional experience, meaning they lead to shame and fear, and for students to choose that self-preservation pathway, which often includes them opting out of the learning to maintain some sense of power. And so with that being said, in our time together today, we are first and foremost going to recognize the power of story as a viable means of assessment because it inspires that productive emotional response that I was just talking about, one that inspires hope, efficacy, and inspires further learning for students. We're going to talk about why story is so fundamental to our humanity because it is the basis for meaning making, finding empathy, and achieving cultural cohesion. And then we're going to zoom out to explore the role of technology, especially technology in our world today, both its pains and its promises, because it is such a great way to amplify student storytelling. Specifically, I'm going to double tap on social media because it's something that is impacting all of our lives. It's impacting our students' lives. And yes, we'll talk about some of the challenges that it offers, but also some of the promises that if we can recognize them as such can become a really engaging tool for students in the school space. And finally, we're going to land on very, very practical ways that you can take away immediately and put into a school or in a classroom for students to not only tell the story of what they are learning. So what, meaning how are they developing those outcomes in the program of studies, and to also tell the story of how they are learning. So giving them the opportunity to reflect on themselves as a learner and tell that story as well. And honestly, spoiler alert, it's that second story that we tend to forget to tell the most. And it's the one that has the biggest impact on all of the what students are learning in class. But we often say, oh, we don't have time. I just don't have time for reflection. So I really want to make the case that this is a critical story that we also hold space to tell. So one of the essential questions that's driving our time together is why are stories fundamental to our humanity? And to reveal that answer, I want to ask you to engage in a quick little thought experiment with me. You ready? If you're looking away, you might want to pause what you're doing and look at the screen right now, because I am about to show you two words that have nothing to do with each other. And I want you to see these two words and notice what happens in your mind. Are you ready? Now, what probably just happened is I put these in sequential order. So your brain saw one and then the other, and I said they have nothing to do with each other, but you found a way to connect them immediately. Your brain probably went, oh, banana, bananas are gross. I don't like bananas. They're sinewy, strange texture. Ugh, vomit. It would make me vomit. And or you love bananas since your background knowledge was like, oh, there must be something wrong with this banana because it caused the person to vomit. Or I could have shown you the words in this order. And you might have connected them in a completely different way. You would have thought, oh, someone's ill. Perhaps they have the flu and a banana is helping them to calm their stomach. But your brain immediately tries to form some kind of a connection between unrelated events. This is true for absolutely all of us. We are going through the world day by day, all the stimulus coming at us, and our brain is trying to put it into a narrative sequence. So there was this, and then this, and this, and my background knowledge is connecting them because I want to know what was the antecedent and the consequence, or what was the cause and the effect. And I'm not just saying this, this is actually an example that comes from a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And in it, he argues that what this is system one thinking. It is the fast, the intuitive, and the emotional parts of our brain. It's the part that is the storyteller going through the world and taking taking things in and quickly trying to make sense. He contrasts this with system two thinking, which is slow, intentional, and rational. And he says, you might think that we use system two thinking for really important decisions like voting in a democratic election or designing our assessment experiences. But the truth is, the research shows that we all consistently revert to system one thinking the more important the decision is, which is fascinating. We revert to that storytelling part of our brain because I think collectively we don't totally understand the impact that stories are having on our brains because they are so powerful. Like we've just explored, it all starts with meaning making. Our minds literally are storytellers. No matter our age, our race, our culture, our sexual orientation, you name it, every single one of us is making sense of the world through stories in a very emotional way. And now there's something really important I have to say here. And again, if you're doing something else, pause, come back to me. Because if you can understand what I'm about to share with you, it will save you thousands on therapy bills. Trust me. And here's what I have to tell you. The stories we tell ourselves create our emotional experiences. I'm going to repeat that because that's super important. The stories we tell ourselves create our emotional experiences. For instance, I didn't fail the mad minute, feel anxiety, and then tell myself my dad's not going to love me anymore. I failed the mad minute, told myself my dad's not going to love me anymore, and felt crippling anxiety. That's how that works. And so the truth is, if we can learn to reveal and revise the narratives that are in our minds, then we can have a different emotional experience. So that is literally the work of mental health, revising those inner narratives to change our emotional experience. And don't we need that now more than ever? So if stories are the basis of meaning making, they directly impact our ability to find empathy and to build cultures. On the empathy side, if I'm making sense of the world through stories and you're making sense of the world through stories, when I hear your story, I'm going to feel something too, because that's how my brain's wired. However, it's a myth that we can truly feel what someone else is feeling and walk in their shoes. But when we hear a story, because our brains are wired for it, we lean in, we engage, and we listen differently, just like you might have done when I started telling that Mad Minute story at the beginning. And now, when it comes to culture, if we each make sense of the world through stories, then the stories that we collectively believe to be true is culture. Culture is really just shared stories. After all, is it not story that has inspired nations to exist, religions, conglomerate corporations? It's compelled us to organize in the face of injustice or motivated people to sacrifice their lives on the battlefield throughout history. Stories are what create emotions, which create experiences, and are the basis of how we maintain cultural cohesion. And so, with all of that being said, I want to ask you to do something for me right now. So, you will be asked to engage here. So, what I want to ask is I'm going to very shortly put a simple statement on the screen. It's not a trick. There's nothing like complex to understand here. It's just a simple statement. And when I do that, I'm going to ask you to do one of two things, to either agree with it. And if you do, to just type yes in the chat, or to disagree with it. And if that's the case, type no in the chat. So yes, if you agree, no, if you disagree. I'm going to ask that you submit your response and then read others' posts. I've been a teacher for a long time, so I know how this works. It's like, all right, go. And you're reading. You're like, yes, we agree. Like, be bold, be yourself, think different. So when I reveal this, just type yes in the chat if you agree, type no in the chat if you disagree, and then you can actually see what other people said. So let me reveal the statement, and then you can agree or disagree in the chat. The statement is this: our students need meaningful, culturally responsive experiences in school. Agree or disagree? Just yes or no. Yeah, I'm seeing lots of yeses. I have you all on record now, my friends, that we all agree. And you weren't cheating. You did this from your heart. You did it from your soul. You completely agree that our students deserve more meaningful, culturally responsive experiences in school. And so if we can all agree with that, based on what we just heard about the power of story as the basis for individual meaning making, to find empathy and to achieve cultural cohesion and represent cultures, we need to take student storytelling very seriously in school in an intentional and in a consistent way. And to do that, it means that we have to ask ourselves a tricky question, one that is meant to be asked alone with no one else judging you, but sitting and reflecting. And the question is this: does our current approach to assessment live up to this need, or do we sacrifice it on the altar of easy? Now, of course, I recognize fully that things are far from easy in education right now. This year alone, I have worked with, at last count, 65 districts and still counting on their assessment and grading practices. And there is a story that I've been hearing again and again and again with every teacher and school that I work with that is making things considerably more challenging in the school space right now. And the story is this: now, what just happened in your mind right now? How did you fill in the gaps for this story? Notice that when I set it up, I intentionally chose the word challenging. Now, that could produce either a productive or a counterproductive emotional response, depending on how you filled in the gaps of the story. For instance, on the one hand, you could be reflecting on the fact that the disengagement, the disillusionment, the rise in violence, the rise in absenteeism is making it really hard to get back to status quo and how we used to do things. And the old tricks just aren't working anymore. And the old things that were our standbys are not landing the way they used to. And it's frustrating and it's infuriating. And you're wondering if you even want to continue in this space anymore. That's one story. Another story someone might be telling themselves is, wow, I think even I've changed post-pandemic. I feel like I look at the world differently. I look at the concept of work differently. I feel like my priorities have changed. And I can see that in the kids too. And I feel like what we're seeing is this collective call to really rethink how we do education and how we even do life and how we build our societies. And the challenge is really this motivating thing. It inspires wonder and curiosity about what might come next. So there are many ways to finish this story, but it's producing an emotional reaction. And of course, it's not just a pandemic that has changed things. There is something else that is infiltrating every aspect of the school experience and the student experience, leading to a rise in mental illness and anxiety and depression. And that thing, if you haven't guessed yet, you probably have, is social media. And that is something we have to negotiate right now. Now, I am someone who, I'll just admit it honestly, I am a tech optimist. It's probably why I connect with folks like Spaces EDU and support a lot of their missions, because I really believe technology is meant to be a tool that supports our growth in positive directions as human beings. And so what I want to do right now is, and first of all, if you're feeling the pain of social media, just throw it in the chat right now. Just say pain, because I can only imagine. I haven't been in the classroom for a couple of years, but I hear the stories from my friends, my colleagues. I can only imagine the pains that you're bumping up against with social media right now. What I want to do is zoom out a little bit here. Just pause and let's zoom out, because I want to talk about how we've arrived at this moment in history where we have this thing called social media. Acknowledge the many pains, and they're very real, and we're going to talk about them, that it's brought into our spaces. But there's something I want to recognize about social media that I think is a very interesting promise for every single one of us in the school space, especially when we think about assessment. So I'm going to ask that we go all the way back to go through our human history to recognize how technology has evolved for that very uniquely human capacity for storytelling. So if we go back to our earliest ancestors, we often, first thing to understand here is we often used storytelling as a way to achieve cultural cohesion. It's the stories that we shared and believed to be true together, so it made us feel part of a group, like I've talked about. So in our earliest ancestors, we had very small communities, and what often worked to tell stories was word of mouth. People would share these stories person to person. Sometimes they'd be captured as images on the walls of a cave. And this oral tradition tended to work well to help people to feel like a cohesive part of a group. But eventually, our population started to grow and it started to spread across geographical locations. So we had a problem. And as we do as human beings, we innovated a solution. We said, okay, we need a different way to tell and to share stories. And this was the invention of the written word. So the written word came along and at the time was often applied to the creation of many religious texts, which told through story how people were to behave as a part of a group. And this achieved cultural cohesion across many geographical locations. But then population expanded more. The monks who sat in monasteries writing these documents by hand could only write so fast. And so we had a problem. We needed to produce more stories. So in 1440, my history nerds probably know exactly what's coming next. In 1440, we had a huge technological breakthrough that kicked off this period in our history that I like to call the media. And that invention in 1440 by Johannes Gutenberg was a little something called the printing press. The printing press created this ability to create a text way faster than someone writing it by hand. And of course, like we do throughout human history, when we invent a new technology, we tend to just replicate exactly what we did before for a little bit until we go, oh, wait, this actually changes everything. We should think about this different. Because what was the first thing that was printed on the Gutenberg printing press? The Bible, Gutenberg's Bible. And then eventually it was like, wait, well, what else? What else could we create? What other stories could we tell? There was the creation of novels, of pamphlets, of newsletters, you name it. And then, of course, this is a big period in history. There is the invention of film technology as a form of media. There was the invention of TV. Then we're getting into digital media, but there's something really interesting about this period in history and why I wanted to clump it together. And it's important to acknowledge so we can recognize the promise of what social media has offered us as a way to engage students. This period in history was defined by a one-way transmission of information. So often what was created through the media came from those who had power in dominant culture to those who did not, and it represented a very limited, biased perspective on a very diverse world. Now, as I'm sure you can all imagine, there is something that happened in the 90s that fundamentally starts to change all of this. It perhaps has been our greatest achievement in terms of innovation as human beings. Some might call it a weapon of mass destruction, but that thing was the internet. So the internet was created, and of course, what do we do as soon as we invent a new technology? We take exactly what we were doing before and we shove it into that technology. So the first thing the internet did was just a way to take our print texts and put them online so you could scroll through. But then eventually, people started wondering, what else could we do with the internet? And that was when social media was born. Social media was a way for people to no longer just receive information like the one-way transmission of the media period in history, but for the first time to tell their own story to a global audience and to find a community of people who align with their worldview and perspective. Of course, we know exactly where the pain comes from here, though, right? Because with that ability, people can now create their own stories through a click of a button, and then algorithms funnel them into echo chambers, which has led to political polarization, the rise of extremist perspectives, also the ability to share your story and then feel it compared to everybody else, which leads to this compare and despair, depression spiral. But I don't want to lose the fact that we have this moment in history where we have seen for the first time a democratization of storytelling, where everyone can tell their story and to form communities based on their worldviews and perspectives and their culture, which is something really, really important and something that I believe is important for us to acknowledge in the school space, that there has been this democratization of voice. And I think it's really important that we all acknowledge and embrace so that we can maintain the relevance of what we're doing in education. So with that, I want to invite us to bring this essential question to the forefront as we head through the rest of today. How might we reimagine assessment as social media? You're right away, you're probably like, wait, what? How did you suddenly bring assessment back into this? Like we were talking technology, storytelling, and then you're like, boom, assessment. Always trying to make assessment happen, Natalie. But I did this very intentionally because assessment is a fundamental part of our practice in education. It's not going anywhere. We need to gather evidence to make decisions. Social media is probably not going anywhere. There's probably going to hopefully be some regulations, and that's a whole story for a different time, but it's not going anywhere. So we can't keep doing everything we've always done and then think about how we might just add on some more engaging, democratized voice experiences of assessment over here. I think we have to reimagine assessment itself as something that democratizes storytelling and voice for students to maintain the relevance of what we do in the school space. What I'm basically saying is, how do we move past the limitations of traditional assessment to tap into this cultural moment and the promise of what social media has brought us? Caveat here before we go any further. I am not an advocate of getting students onto social media platforms. Let me be very clear about this. In fact, I'm reading a book right now called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. If you're feeling the pains of the social media moment, I highly recommend. He uses a wide body of research to argue that we need to not only regulate social media and smartphones around our youth, but just make it so they're not accessible. They are not allowed on social media. They're not allowed on smartphones. I didn't totally agree at first, but the more I'm reading the book, the more I lean in that direction. I think some of the intent behind the creators of these platforms is not something I agree with. And when I zoom out and I think of it across human history, I'm really excited about the possibilities for the democratization of storytelling. So that is really what I'm wanting to tap into here as we look through the lens of assessment. Now, I have to clarify something, and I am an assessment nerd. I kind of warned you in advance, so bear with me for a second. You might have just heard that essential question and thought, wait, so you're saying that we should just water things down when it comes to assessment and make it more fun for kids? Won't that sacrifice the cognitive rigor of what we do in the school space? Au contraire, mon ami. It's actually the opposite. We're actually going to get more cognitive rigor by reimagining assessment of social media. And here's what I mean. So bear with my assessment nerd for a second. First thing you have to understand to recognize a concept in assessment called target method match, which was proposed by Rick Stiggins and Jen Shapui, is the fact that there are only two assessment methods. You either have students pick an answer or they produce an answer. They pick an answer or they produce an answer. Of course, you're now looking at the screen and you're like, there's three. And she said two, but she also failed the Mad Minutes, so we're not going to hold that against her. I know there's three, so bear with me. So in the literature, when they talk about assessment methods, selected response is when students pick an answer. We know this well. This is multiple choice, fill in the blanks, matching, all of that. Constructed response is when they produce an answer. It can be written, but it could also be oral. It could also be visual. It could be a combination of all three. Performance assessment is emerging and it's as a separate category, but it's technically just a constructed response because students are still producing an answer. However, what makes performance assessment different is it emulates the authentic context that the learning would be used within. So it is more authentic assessment. It's more relevant assessment. Now, this is a part I really need you to pay close attention to because this is a pretty big finding in the research. I want you to watch something on the screen right now. So what you're seeing behind these three assessment methods, selected, constructed, and performance, is something called Bloom's taxonomy. If you have an education degree, you probably know exactly what this is. For anyone who doesn't recognize it, basically it's a taxonomy of the different ways that humans think, from lower order or low cognitive rigor, such as remembering, recall, summarizing, that type of thinking, all the way up to what would be called higher order thinking or more high cognitive rigor. That's things like analyzing, evaluating, creating. Now, what you're seeing on the screen is the target method match in action, because researchers have found that some assessment methods elicit more valid evidence of thinking than others. For instance, selected response, multiple choice, fill in the blanks, matching, gives us the most valid evidence of low cognitive rigor, remembering, recall, summarizing. But as we move into higher cognitive rigor demonstrations of learning, things like analyzing, applying, evaluating, we need to get into constructed response. We need to have more diverse options for students to demonstrate their thinking. And we need to bring in more relevance to really light up all the different regions of their brain effectively. And yet, here's what's really interesting from these findings. As students move through the K-12 education experience and the curriculum, the program of studies moves from more basic low cognitive rigor to higher cognitive rigor demonstrations, the predominant assessment method becomes selected response. So what we have is a target, we need higher cognitive rigor, method, selected response, mismatch. We have a problem. It's not aligning with the research finding of the most valid evidence. Why is this happening? Well, when people are being really honest with me, and when I was being honest with myself early in my career, it's easier. It's easier to mark a lot of quizzes and tests that you can quickly score right from wrong when you have more students. And there's another reason people often give me, well, that's the format that most standardized testing takes. So we have to do the same thing in school to replicate and rehearse what they're going to be doing on the standardized tests. We have to talk about that for a hot second. Allow me to get this off my chest, if you don't mind. When we talk about standardized testing, and I'm not here to, I won't go in a soapbox about my opinion or beliefs around it. There is one thing that we know to be true. When they're designed, they usually hire brilliant psychometric brains that analyze wide bodies of data to arrive at the questions that they put on there so they can work towards some measure of validity with these selected response instruments. When an individual teacher in a classroom is putting together a multiple choice test, they do not match that level of psychometric analysis. And what ends up happening is they tend to create something that misses the mark in terms of the types of thinking they're trying to elicit. So it really isn't a rehearsal. They are not eliciting the same types of thinking. The best thing we can do, which is what the research talks about in classroom assessment, is design open-ended constructive response performance assessment opportunities if we really want to see evidence of evaluating, analyze, applying, because it gives us more information to do the most important thing of all, which is to respond to the information, to use the information formatively, to intervene when learning has not happened, to provide feedback and further opportunities for learning to occur, which is really what the goal is at the end of the day. So I just had to say that. But the point here is that when we think about student storytelling as a means of assessment, something oral or written or visual or all three, something that at times emulates something authentic students would do in our social media age, we're not lowering the cognitive rigor at all. We are in fact raising it. So I just want to be crystal clear about that. And now with that being said, I do want to share with you some very practical ways that we can support students to tell the story of what they're learning and how they're learning. So what you're seeing in front of you right now is a matrix to organize the different practical examples I'm going to provide for you. So across the top is we can support students to tell the story of what they're learning. As a reminder, that's how they're making sense of the outcomes in the program of studies. And we can support students to tell the story of how they're learning. So who they are becoming as a learner, reflecting on themselves. I've said it before, I'm gonna say it again. The story of how students are learning might seem like an add-on right now. It might seem like, well, I've got so much that I have to cover that the what is all I really have time for. But the research cannot be more clear that when we hold space for students to reveal and revise those inner narratives they're telling themselves about who they are as a learner, and we help them to intervene and to shift their emotional experience, it will accelerate the learning in what they're doing. You really do need both these things. We really do need to hold space for both these things. And I know a lot of you are joining from BC, so you are no strangers to supporting students through a reflective practice. You hopefully have started to see the power of what this can look like. So that's across the top. Down the side of this matrix, it says micro and macro. That's a reminder that we can pull a micro story. We can create an opportunity for a micro story from students, which means they just gather evidence from a single lesson to tell a story. Or we can ask for a more macro story where they have to pull evidence from an entire project or an entire course or even an entire grade, I'm going to give you an example of, to effectively tell a story and to consolidate that learning. So let's start in the column of what students are learning. So how are they gathering evidence of and making sense of the program, the outcomes in the program of studies? On a very micro level, you could invite students to explain a metaphor. You're like, wait, what does that have to do with storytelling? If you don't remember what a metaphor is, it's where we say one thing is something else to help describe it. So we say, courage is a lion. That's a metaphor. Unlike a simile, which is where we use like or as. And if you're like, what does that have to do with storytelling? I want to remind you of the banana vomit activity we did at the beginning. Storytelling is often about drawing parallels and connections and trying to find a meaningful relationship between things. So this is exactly what storytelling is in our brain. So how this could work, I'm going to give you an example because I know this sounds very like English teacher. And if you are a math teacher and you're like, absolutely not, you've already lost me, we're going to do a math example of this just to show you how this could work. I want you to imagine for a second that you are a student in my class and we are doing a lesson on adding and subtracting integers. Okay. Some of you might need a quick refresher on how we add and subtract integers, so let me give you one. As we move through, it's really helpful to imagine a number line moving up and down this number line above and below zero. And one of the hardest things that we were just working through in class is the fact that when you subtract a negative number from a negative number, it's like adding a positive number. So if I go -5 minus -10, it's like -5 plus 10, and in fact results in +5. And that's a tricky thing. And folks are like making sense of it. They're doing some practice questions. And I want to see with a little bit more rigor, do they really understand what we're doing here? So I'm going to invite each student to now create a metaphor and to tell the story of that metaphor. So I go into a website called Unsplash. Write that down if you've never heard of it. Unsplash, where you can get free, royalty-free pictures that are done by professional photographers and look beautiful. And I just pick the first 30 pictures and I give each student a picture. So I give you this picture and I say, okay, this is your picture. What do you notice? And you're like, well, it's a car in the winter. And I say, okay, so let's imagine it's like a car driving in winter. Now I want you to finish this statement. Adding and subtracting integers is driving a car in winter because. Go ahead and think through it for a second. I'm going to take a drink of water so I stop talking, but think through it. Feel what your brain does. How would you finish that sentence? If you're feeling so bold, feel free to throw it in the chat. What's probably happening in your brain right now, if you're starting to think through, is first you're going, okay, I need to remember everything I can think of about adding and subtracting integers. And maybe that was easy to come to mind, maybe not. And you're also saying, okay, well, what do I know about driving a car in winter? Maybe you have background knowledge of it, maybe you don't. Maybe have to Google it. So you're like, how do you drive a car in winter? So you have to know some things. You have to know these two pools of things. Then you have to take a next step and you have to compare and analyze the relationships between those things. As someone who lived in Alberta for 10 years, I have a lot of experience with driving in winter that I'm excited to show off here in Vancouver. But I immediately think about the fact that the hardest thing for me is when you subtract a negative number, it's actually like adding and it kind of breaks the rules for a second. And that's where I found the parallel. I was like, when you drive a car in the winter, the things that you used to do are really the wrong choice. For instance, you don't want to slam on your brakes when you want to stop quickly because that's going to send your car into a tailspin. You have to kind of pump the brakes. You want to gear down and avoid using your actual brake. So the rules that used to work when the road was clear, such as when we're adding and subtracting positive numbers, are flipped and are reversed when we're looking at it through a negative number lens. That's how I'd make my description between the two. Now, that probably was a little bit harder than maybe you first thought when I said we're going to just create a metaphor. And the reason being, it's actually something in our brains called high road bridging, where our brain is trying to pull two unlike things that have been put in two different schemas and try to create a new connection between them. And remember how I said at the very beginning that we all make meaning through stories? We draw these parallels and connections. And because of that, when we hear someone else's story, it sparks something within us. Here's where this activity really matters and why storytelling matters so much in the school space. Formative assessment. Something isn't formative just because we say so. It's our response to the information for instructional utility that makes it truly formative. It's not formative just because we say you're doing it just for fun and not for grades. We actually need to use it. So what if every student were supported to put their picture with their caption metaphor explained onto a digital portfolio, like say, I don't know, Tatiana, Spaces EDU. And from there, they could go through and see what people posted at the start of class the next day. And they would pick one that really resonated with them. And they would write a reflection on what helped, how this helped them to understand, how it got them thinking differently. And then based on what they learned, take a post-it note and put a little reminder on the top of their desk before they get into the next activity, which is asking them to build on their knowledge of adding and subtracting integers. That could be a powerful formative assessment, and it's done through a micro story of what students are learning. Okay, so that's on the micro level. I now want to zoom out, and this one's fun, onto a macro story that we could support students in telling the story of what they are learning. And this is something called digital storytelling. Now, digital storytelling, if you've never heard of a digital story, it's very simple. They typically are about 3 to 5 minutes in length. They are multimedia, meaning it often includes the student writing and then saying a voiceover, matching it really intentionally to visual images, and then usually putting some kind of music under it to create an emotional experience. Now, of course, again, you might be like, this feels like an English teacher thing. And yeah, sure. I've used this in English classes. It's been very successful when you get students to practice their writing skills, practice their speaking skills, their digital literacy, their visual literacy. You can get a whole host of evidence of what they're learning in English. But where I actually found the most success with this format for students to share what they're learning was in content heavy courses like science and social studies. Let me give you an example of a middle school science project that we once did that totally changed how a group of really challenging students engaged. So first of all, when I came together with this middle school team and said, we're really struggling to get our students to buy in, to engage, we're doing kind of all the typical things, we need to rethink how we do science. I was like, challenge accepted, let's go. So they said, we want to do a nature documentary project. So instead of doing our very typical adaptations and ecosystems unit, let's just do it totally differently. I said, sure. So first of all, there is something really meta here. Like there's layers, because though the final product was a digital story, we also planned the project through a storytelling lens to support students to have a story to tell at the end. And that storytelling lens, as you can see on the screen, is called Ki, Sho, Ten, Ketsu. This is really cool. So in our Western cultures, we often imagine stories as having three parts, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they often revolve around a conflict and someone emerges as the winner. In Eastern storytelling tradition, there's often four parts to a story, and that story revolves around a twist. And after the twist, the character and the settings have to recalibrate and find harmony, and the word often used is find reconciliation. Just a totally different cultural value embedded in that story structure, which in and of itself is fascinating and something I think we should pay attention to in Western cultures. So what we did is we broke up this project into these four parts. These are the four milestones. So how it works, Key is the introduction of the characters in the setting. Show is a further development of those characters and setting. 10 means twist. So some new elements introduced that people then have to grapple with. They have to draw that connection between. And then Ketsu is a restoration of harmony. How does everything then come back together? So we use this to plan a project. For the key, the development, or the introduction, sorry, students first learned about adaptations in ecosystem, then applied that knowledge to design one of their own. So they took the very traditional unit test they would have taken at the end of the project, but we did it before. Why? Because selected response is the most valid means of gathering evidence of remembering and recall. So that's what we used it for. So they built their own, they designed their own ecosystem. It had to have producers, consumers, all the main parts. Then we invited them to build an actual physical model of their imagined ecosystem. So it's just a further development of that introduction. Do the students love this? Absolutely, especially in middle school. They got all their materials and supplies, and it's an absolute hot mess in there. Way too many times, though, this is where I see teachers finish. They do the unit test, the learning's done, so they throw on this little like fun dessert project that's kind of just like, we'll give it like 10% in the grade book because it doesn't really matter. And they miss the opportunity to tell the rest of the story, because here's where it gets good. Now that students in teams built a physical model of their imagined ecosystem, we had them then, this is the twist, pull a human impact card. So things like deforestation, pollution, all the ways we're impacting ecosystems. And they had to construct a response, written response, about how that human impact would affect their very carefully designed ecosystem. As teachers, they could give feedback, they could guide, they could nudge their thinking and make sure that they're actually pulling from a depth of accurate knowledge. And here's where it gets really fun, because we have to then bring this all back together to restore harmony. So what we had students do was to then create a nature documentary to tell the story of their ecosystem and the impact that humans are having on it. And so they had this digital storytelling film festival. And here's my favorite part. We actually did this right before COVID. And as COVID hit, we're like, oh my gosh, this project is destroyed. It's not going to work. But what we quickly realized is let's just pivot it into a Google website. So they finished their documentaries and we put them all on a Google site. And we actually got a budget to send these little like party packs home for families with a movie ticket. And they all joined at the same time to watch all the movies together and to add comments. And there was popcorn and treats for them to share with their family. It ended up being this really magical experience. I'll never forget when I walked into the learning team office the next day, because at the time I was a coach. And my colleagues are like, how did you do that? I was like, what do you mean? They're like, we've been working with this group for the entire year and got nothing out of them. They are so resistant. It was a group that had been put together as like the low group. Not that I recommend doing that, but that's what it was. And I honestly was like, I'm not special. I didn't do anything special, but this is the first time a big light bulb went off that there is something special in storytelling. It does something to our brains and engages us in a deeper, more meaningful way than a lot of the traditional ways that we evidence learning in the school space. Okay, so that's the couple examples of what students are learning. Let's now flip and talk about how students are learning. And like I said before, I sometimes think this is the most important and the most forgotten story that we don't tell in the school space is who are they becoming as a learner? How are we giving them times to reflect on themselves and revise those narratives in their mind so that they can move through those emotional blocks and deeper engage in what they're learning? So there's two things I want to offer you on a micro level. We're going to talk about something called a conflict exit ticket. And I'll actually give you an example of one and talk about why we do them and how to use them formatively. And on a macro level, I want to talk about something that I'm seeing emerge quickly across North America that a lot of schools and districts are putting into practice, and it's called a defensive learning. So let's start with the conflict exit ticket. So you're probably very familiar with the concept of an exit ticket, nothing new. Typically, it's at the end of class. It's often a formative assessment in the sense that teachers will just ask a question about what was learned in class that day, and they'll look at it to make sure that students remembered and recalled or understood what was described, and then they just move on to the next day. So a conflict exit ticket asks students to reflect and gather evidence of a different story, which is more about how they're learning. And the purpose of it is to normalize the idea of productive struggle, to help them understand that in our Western cultures, the story that we often tell is around conflict. You have a main character who has a problem, and then they have to persevere through solving it. If they lean into their tragic flaw, they're going to make bad decisions and they're going to have a tragic outcome. But this is basically how story works. And the joke I've made recently, and I think the students I've heard this from students, so this is why I'm saying it, is you basically want to give students main character energy. You want them to see themselves as the hero of the story going through these classes each day. So here's how it works. They first have to define when they reflect on class, what type of conflict did you face today? Was it learner versus learner? Did you have an issue with someone else? Learner versus environment? Was it noisy? Was it too loud? Was it too quiet? Was it uncomfortable? Whatever. Learner versus content, so with the actual stuff we're working through, or was it learner versus self? And I often describe this one for kids as, were you feeling bored, an overwhelming sense of boredom? Were you feeling anxious? Were you feeling hyper? Like, was there an emotional thing going on for you that made it really hard to focus? And then they get to say a bit more about the conflict they faced. So this is the constructed response, so we can see more. And then they answer, did you resolve it? Yes or no? If yes, how did you do it? If no, how might you try to resolve the same conflict in the future? Obviously, the reflection here is powerful, but where it really gets some great formative assessment instructional utility, you could do this on a digital platform, say like a Google form. And as a teacher, you would then be able to quickly see where most people are having a conflict in the classroom. So let's say most people struggled with the environment that day. You could go through and see what some of the responses were for the environment, write them as a challenge and say, okay, here's a challenge that came up from yesterday. Start class with it on the board. I want you to turn to the person next to you. What strategies or ideas do you have for how we might solve this challenge? And you write some of those ideas on the board. Again, you give each kid a post it and you say, pick the one strategy that you most want to try today. And maybe some of them are feedback for us, which is really important feedback too, of things we need to change in the classroom. But everyone takes one strategy, puts it on their desk, and then they try to live into that day. So this is something that just really shows everyone we are in this problem solving mindset together of constantly figuring out how to show up as a really productive learner and work through the conflicts we're having, rather than see it as a complete barrier to moving forward. So that's a conflict exit ticket. Now I want you to imagine this is going along on a micro level, maybe not every day, maybe it's once a week, whatever flow feels right for the teacher. And after a period of time, we want students to be able to tell a deeper, richer, more fulsome story of how they're developing as a learner. All these little bits of evidence are absolutely going to go into it, but we might at some point invite them to do something called a defensive learning. This is more of a macro story. This is a story that can be done at the end of a course, can be done at the end of a project, or it can be done at the end of an entire grade if it's more of a school initiative. And how they often work is they're based around some core ideas or competencies. So my BC folks, this is like your jam. This works so well for competency development because we have these, you have them now in your curriculum for every single course that you teach. But for a lot of schools in the States, what I'm finding is they create something called a portrait of a graduate, in which they pull out those core competencies that they want to be developed across their school or across their district. And then students are expected at different periods of time to stand up and give these more formal presentations where they really tell the story of here's where I started, here's what I was struggling with, but here's what I did. And as a result, here's how I'm developing my character, or I'm developing creativity, or I'm developing critical thinking. But it's really hard to tell this story if we haven't been giving students those micro stories along the way. If all that happens, and I've seen this happen in schools, is we're going to keep doing all the same traditional assessment we've always done. And then we tell students, okay, tell a story of learning. You're going to end up with a bunch of kids that talk about the grades they received on different things. That's not the story of who they're becoming as a learner. So we have to intentionally build on those reflective opportunities. And I think it's really important here to acknowledge that a digital tool can really help with that outcome. And so obviously we're here, thankfully, all brought together by Spaces EDU. I've seen their platform. I'm really excited about what they're doing. This can be a great place to put your core competencies on the right side, identify them for the course, start having students do different reflective opportunities. They can tag it to those core competencies. When it comes time for a more fulsome defensive learning, they can click on it and see all the evidence they might bring into their presentation, all those little micro stories that are building up to a macro story. For instance, if they're continuously struggling with themselves, if it's this constant internal conflict, or if it's with other people and they're noticing how it's coming up again and again, that might really be that call to action to how else can I solve this? I need to get more support. I need to zoom out and be able to tell this story at the end of the year about how I'm really working through my lack of motivation and figuring out where that's coming from. Like, what a fascinating story to tell. And I think a digital portfolio can be a really great tool to do that. So with all that being said, as we're nearing the end of our time together, we have talked today about how we can reimagine assessment through story, and it creates this more meaningful, culturally responsive experience for students in school, because that is the power of story. And I have you all on record that you agree that that is something that our students deserve. And we've also talked about how storytelling isn't about just making things more fluffy and fun for students, that in fact, it's a form of constructed assessment methods called performance assessment that actually raises the cognitive rigor of what we're asking students to do. Think back to that example of the nature documentary project. We started with the multiple choice test to make sure the understanding of the basic information was recalled. And then we moved deeper and deeper and deeper into that higher cognitive rigor as students pulled things together. And finally, as you saw, when we support students to tell the story of both what and how they're learning, those two things together can really activate their agency. Notice I didn't say empower, because I think all students have agency and power within them already. It's up to us as the adults cultivating the space that they exist for many years of their life to remove the barriers for them to demonstrating their agency. And traditional assessment and grading has absolutely been one of those barriers for too long. Because the truth is, when students are the storytellers, the education story changes. For too long, education has reflected this period in our history that was the media. That was like a one-way transmission of information that often represented a very limited and biased perspective on the world. But now, just like social media has offered us this democratization of storytelling, so it's not just about consuming information, it's also now about creating it. We have to think of school as a place where teachers aren't people who just give information to students. They now create the opportunities for students to use it and to do something with it. So if we can imagine a classroom where students are supported to connect the learning of course content through story, then we can imagine students who are also able to work through productive struggles and to reframe their narratives about who they are as a learner. Then we can imagine a school where every single student is supported to stand up on a stage at the end of the year and tell a really rich, meaningful story about who they're becoming as a learner in the defense of learning. And then we can even imagine a society where every single person has the actual competencies they need to thrive in our very complex, ever-changing world today, and has the agency to take action and make productive outcomes happen in their life. Because these competencies didn't just fall out of the sky. They are something that comes from a huge research finding in the late 90s, early 2000s. That was a global project to figure out what do people most need to live well in our world today through work, but also just who they are as a human being. And those competencies, these things like critical thinking, collaboration, communication, creativity, emerged as the answer. So these aren't just coming from nowhere. They really are what is needed to be successful in the world today. Now, as we wrap up, I can imagine that some of you might be telling yourselves this story right now. You're like, yeah, that all sounds lovely, but who am I to change such a complex system? Like, I'm just a teacher, or I'm just a leader in one school. Who am I to do anything about it? Okay, that's one story, but I want to offer you a different one. And it comes from Peter Senge, who is someone who has spent his entire career researching organizational change. And through his research, he emerged at this finding. When people who are actually creating a system start to see themselves as the source of their problems, they invariably discover a new capacity to create the results they truly desire. So what does he mean by that? What Peter Senge means after a lifetime of research is that the system isn't something out there that we have to battle against, that we are actually the system. So the system doesn't change, allowing us to take the first step. We take the first step, and then the system starts to change because we are creating the system. So I really hope as you joined us today and engaged in this conversation and we're sharing things in the chat and reflecting, that you found one small step that you're inspired by, that you want to take as you head into the school year. And if you would be so bold and kind as to offer me this feedback, I would love to hear what is one small thing that you want to, that's going to stick with you from this presentation. Maybe it's something you want to try. It's something you're still thinking about. It was something I said that really resonated with you. Maybe it was just a reaffirmation of something you already know. But if you wouldn't mind sharing that in the chat right now as we wrap up, that would be wonderful. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Natalie. So
Mhm.
as Natalie mentioned, please feel free to submit your answers into chat. What really stood out for me was the bit about activating agency versus using the term empower. I definitely think that students today could benefit from activation of their agency. I come from a higher education background where I saw students at the end of their K-12 journeys where they're entering university, and I think they would have definitely benefited a lot from a competency-based education or learning.
Mm,
That's why I'm a big fan of the defensive learning or the profile of a graduate, things that folks are doing in the States.
yeah, me
Yeah.
too. I'm super excited about how that's starting to get brought in more fulsomely and curious. I mean, anyone from BC jump in, but I feel like it so perfectly aligns with the BC context and core competencies. I'm
No, absolutely.
excited to see how that might become something that we see more across this province.
Yeah, lots of talk about the book, The Anxious
Yeah.
Generation. I know Yvette was a big fan, and I have to Google it now and read it for myself.
Yeah, it's pretty, it gets people going. I'll warn you, those who are going to read it. My partner had a very different stance in it than I did when I started because I'm, like I said, I'm a tech optimist. So I'm always nervous about the removal of anything from people and
Right.
the moral panic around it. So
Hmm.
I'm still grappling with it, but the more I hear and the more I see, I just feel like what purpose is there for really, really young children to have social media and smartphones? Like, there isn't a good rationale for it until they're old enough to process through how to use it thoughtfully.
No,
Yeah.
no, for sure. Exactly. Oh, Jill says it's already in her cart.
I saw that. We'll have to start a book club.
Yes, Spaces EDU book club.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Well, if anyone has any questions as well, feel free to drop them in the chat. Was there any that came up for you, Tatiana?
I'm not seeing anything right now. Just a lot of gratitude in the chat. Folks were really grateful for your insights. They seem
Yeah.
to have taken a lot from today. Great conversation starters, seems so
Mhm.
very exciting, and would love to hear all of your feedback in the follow-up survey that you'll receive by email after today. Uh, but we are going to start the next session very shortly at 1:05, and I'm getting word from my colleague that she needs to start setting up. So
Okay.
I won't let you keep you for too long, Natalie. But
Okay.
again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, out of your morning, to join us and the Spaces EDU group. And thank you to everybody
Yeah.
who joined us today as well. You could have been anywhere, but you chose to be here with us.
Yeah.
So really
Thank you
grateful
so
for that.
much. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. Have a great start to the school year, and hopefully I see you around some social media spaces in the near future.
Take care,
Ironically.
everybody. See you in the next one.
Bye.
Bye.